Welcome to the Art of Marketing Operations, a Taylor podcast. I'm Glenn Bottomley, and today my guest is Heather Carl, Marketing Operations Manager at Missouri Employers Mutual, a workers' compensation provider based in Missouri. Thanks for joining us today, Heather.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. I appreciate it.
Well, let's jump right in. Now, you are currently working for the largest workers' compensation provider in the state of Missouri. This has absolutely got to be a rewarding, organization to work for, because every day you're clearly making a real impact on helping companies prevent injuries and, reducing insurance claims and, ultimately reducing insurance premiums. So how do you sort of incorporate those real benefits into your marketing operations activities from day to day?
Well, you're right, Glenn. I am very fortunate to work for a company that gets to make a difference in people's lives. And, it's one of those things where working for a company that has our customers and then their employees' best interest at heart makes marketing a little easier in some ways. We just inherently have a very generous mission. And I know a lot of people think of insurance a little differently. I would guess that any marketing person in an insurance company would tell you the same thing. People are like, oh, I have to have insurance and it's another expense to my budget and I don't even really use it. So those types of things can happen, and it can be a challenge even when your company really does have the best interest at heart for everybody involved. And so that's something that we really work to counteract as far as a daily messaging, those types of things, because it does take a bite out of people's budget. And I think that when you think about insurance, there are those basic pieces that no matter what line you're writing, it doesn't matter. It's risk and exposure. So that's how your premium is determined, whether it's your car insurance or your work comp insurance. All of those things go into play. And at the end of the day, when you don't have coverage, then it can really put you personally, and then especially for a business, at a lot of risk when a claim comes in, because there can be some pretty big numbers associated with those, especially on the job injuries. And so we've seen instances where, that would potentially put places out of business if they didn't have the coverage. So it is really important, and it's important to those employees who may get injured as well. In a respect, they're going to be covered. They know they're going to be covered if something were to happen. And so our job essentially is to help people not get injured. So you don't really have to have a higher premium, and you also can keep your workforce healthy.
I appreciate that background. And then from a marketing operations perspective, you actually have an interesting background. So I remember when we chatted before, when you came out of college, you had a degree in broadcast journalism. And then you sort of started your career in as an information specialist, and you had a lot of sort of early marketing assignments and so forth. But for the last 4 years, you've now been sort of driving a marketing operations team, and so you're responsible for strategy, creative, production, measurement, metrics, et cetera, a lot more. So what's the best advice that you would have for other marketing operations team members on how do you expand your responsibilities and add more responsibilities to your plate, but ensuring that you still are always delivering the highest quality deliverables for and from your team?
That's a great question, Glenn. And marketing has changed a lot over the years since I was in school. And like you said, I had different assignments early on. I would say there's probably two pieces of advice I would share as far as trying to increase responsibilities, but also maintain that work quality and that product quality. First, I would say don't be afraid to try something new. And so I know people say that all the time, but I specifically mean around your skill set. So maybe you don't have an expertise in every piece of marketing. Really, almost no one does. And it can be intimidating to think, well, how can I manage that when I don't understand it or I'm not an expert in it, those types of things. But I think it's important to just give yourself the opportunity to go ahead and learn about those different pieces. Marketing is a rapidly changing industry with technology And just the way we use analytics today, there's a lot more to it than there used to be. And so I would say, making sure you're being agile in that way. Give yourself some grace and learn some new things. And it's okay to not know it all at first. And then the second piece I would say is about prioritizing. Anybody who works on a marketing team knows there are lots of different things going on at one time, whether it's a small piece for social or a full campaign or that's part of it, etc. All those different things, lots of balls in the air at one time. You really have to be a master juggler to keep it all going. So prioritizing is really important for the team as well as for an operations manager. And by that I mean, first understand what your corporate strategic goals are. And the way that we've found it works best is starting to map the work you're doing according to those goals, and which one of those is the highest priority right now. Is it regarding revenue? Is it regarding reducing injuries? Is it regarding different, if every industry is a little different, but making sure that what you're doing is fully aligned with that and then prioritizing based on that. That way, you're meeting the business's needs while also making sure you're meeting the right marketing needs. So with so many things in play at once, something has to be most important, and that's how we choose to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to your point, you talked about a lot of the variety that happens, in marketing operations, and also talk about priorities. And I know that one of your marketing operations priorities is also a podcast, just like this one, and Work Safe podcast. It's the Work Safe podcast,
Yes.
correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that and why that's a priority for you?
Yes. So, yes, we have the Work Safe podcast, and we started it several years ago when podcasting was kind of first catching on. And it was an experiment. It was one of those, we're going to try new things. And we started with a focus on sharing some success stories, some of our policyholders that implemented some safety things that made a huge difference in their productivity, efficiency, injuries, all of that. Once we kind of got our feet wet there, we decided that, there's actually an audience for this. There are people that really want to know more about keeping their workplace safe. Podcasts are great because you can listen on the go. You don't have to have your computer. People can really ingest that information anywhere, anytime. And so we expanded our mission with that. And really now what we focus on are broader topics. And so we focus on things, for example, last year, we did a full series on mental health in the workplace. We focused on some industry-specific pieces that you may not have thought about, and then we did some more wider pieces. This year, we've been also focusing a lot on what happens when a business, there's a lot of turnover. We've focused on new hire injuries. We've focused on how do you really apply things across the board, such as slips, trips, and falls that can happen anywhere, strains and sprains. These are top loss drivers. And so our audience can then take that information, and if they're not a policyholder, which many, many times they're not, they can sign up for our Safety Buzz newsletter. So we promote that on the podcast. It's easy to do online. You literally go to the link, click, I'd like to subscribe. We don't ask a million questions about you, just a couple. And then you get it emailed to you every month. And that's been a really great way for us to expand our reach. We also use that podcast. It's honestly our main source of content. So we pull blogs from it. We do social posts. We really kind of reach every channel using the podcast topics and information. So, you really get a lot out of just that one way of communicating. So for us, it's been a great option and something that we've had a lot of good feedback about. So we're excited to do it.
Well, congratulations. That sounds like just a fantastic source of content and real good engagement across the board. So congratulations on pulling that together. I know the challenge and the amount of effort to pull together a podcast for sure. So congratulations on that. Okay, so let's dive into something that I know that you are very passionate about, and that is workflow and technology, and specifically how they work together. So first off, talk to us a little bit about why, in your opinion, is workflow and technology so important to the success of a marketing operations team?
Well, honestly, I think that the two go together. You really, honestly, if you just have one, you're definitely going to be missing out on efficiency. You're going to be missing out on collaboration. There's a lot of pieces there. And so I feel like for any high performing marketing team, you've got to have both. You've got to have established workflows, and then you've also got to have some technology to back it up and make it run. And one of the things that I've found in establishing workflows, it's trial and error, and remembering that every single team is different. Whether you're an agency or a corporation, whatever your scenario is, you're going to have different people on those teams with different skill sets and different roles. And so you really, it's one thing to take some advice like, well, you have these 3 pieces of your workflow. That's a great starting point. But what I've found to be the most effective is really understanding the strengths and the weaknesses of each member of your team. And so by that, I mean, how do they work best? What is their work style? What are our deadlines like? Those types of things. Incorporating that into more of a customized workflow so that at the end of the day, everybody is bought in, everybody feels comfortable, and it's meeting your needs. So you can't, don't just try to apply a one size fits all to it. And then once you've got that figured out, okay, how do we work best? What is going to give us the best product? Now, how do we keep track of it all? And I know since a lot of teams work remote now, including my own, it's an even more important thing to have. Gone are the days where most of us will walk over to the desk of someone and just ask a question. Now we're using messaging and emails and things like that. We rely on all of those things. But their emails are difficult to follow, at least in my opinion, when you've got multiple people chiming in. It's kind of like a group text. It can be a bit cumbersome. And also when you're talking about real-time communication, not everyone responds to their emails in the same way. So that's where technology comes in. And a project management platform, I think, is key to that, whether you're on the simple end of that or the more complex end of that with something like a Jira or Slack kind of in the middle there, those types of things. I think, and that again is based on the comfort level of your team and the tech savviness and the amount of time they're willing to invest in using that platform. So those things are all key in picking it. But for our team, we feel like we've kind of found the sweet spot there where we got buy-in from everybody. Everybody's using it now, and it allows us to not only keep track of what's going on, but it also allows us to kind of record those conversations. So not only for this piece of work are we using this workflow and technology, we can go back and look at our archived piece and see what worked and what didn't. And it's really helpful to be able to review that once all the work is done and apply it to your next project.
Well, and so you talked about, in really good detail there, about how you sort of identify the workflows, how do you work with your team, et cetera. If I could ask a deeper question there, which is, so you just said, so we're working good, everything is working, and so forth. How do you ultimately know when you've arrived? In other words, how do you determine whether or not your workflow is truly optimized? And and what other advice can you give about how do you avoid sort of the workflow pitfalls that can happen, going down the wrong path?
Well, yeah, there's definitely some pitfalls that can happen. So as far as how I gauge as far as where we are in a sweet spot or what's working and what's the optimal way for us to do workflow, I like to think of it as close to a well-oiled machine as possible. And, in marketing, just like many other areas of businesses, things come up, things that weren't planned, those types of things. And you really have to be able to shift to that. Having a workflow is almost the only way to do that without a lot of interruption. And so one of the ways that I like to gauge it is looking back on different types of work, whether it's a social plan or strictly a website plan, or if it's an integrated approach, and walking through each step. How did that work? How many questions did we have to ask afterward? Where did we have stumbling blocks? How many times were there miscommunications? Those types of things. And then looking at any of those pain points and kind of deciding, could we have mitigated that or could we not? Sometimes you can't, most of the time you can. And so for me, when things kind of run in an order, that to me kind of tells me this workflow is working.
Yeah,
it's not always going to happen.
You sort of have like a built-in feedback loop there too, that, initiate this, is that working, bring it back, iterative approach, almost agile approach really from a process perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Now, you've talked a bit about the collaboration that you do with, within the marketing operations team. Can you provide some, power tips, in terms of how should a marketing operations team work with other teams across the organization?
That it's so important. It's just as important as working well amongst your own team. And so my power tip would be listen. Simply put, I think that is the key to working with the other groups. Sometimes marketing has, we have ideas and we come into a conversation with preconceived ideas, right? So we're like, well, we should do this and we suggest that and all of those things. But I think it's just as important not only to have innovative ways to express those, it's just as important to listen to what they're saying. Listen to what those cross-functional teams are saying and what they really need. And sometimes they may also have an idea of how to achieve that goal, but through a conversation, I like to call them brainstorms, through those you can often find that, you know what, that's a great idea, but it doesn't actually meet the need. Let's go back and revisit this. And the most successful marketing pieces are ones that actually meet the need that was set out to define. Sometimes that can be ambiguous, and I think knowing that up front is important. But also taking the time to listen, digest the information. You don't have to have an answer right away. You don't have a proposal as soon as they share that. But really doing that. And I think it's one of those things too, especially for the role that I'm in, as well as my team members, but I probably do it a little bit more heavily in our organization, is taking the time to meet with them. So nobody wants more meetings. I mean, nobody ever said, I'd like to fill up my calendar with more meetings. And meetings can definitely be a waste of time. So you don't want to have ones, that aren't important. But I think those upfront discussions are so very important. And it's definitely worth, I've found, taking the time, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour, to really truly meet and have a conversation versus an email back and forth or so-and-so said, actually truly, kind of sitting down and having that conversation about what they're wanting to achieve and walking through it that way. And remembering to listen for most of that meeting versus sharing information and just kind of taking it all in.
Yeah, I very much agree with the notion of listening. It's, I think I've shared on this podcast before that, a very early mentor in my career talked about just the importance of the business is really all about people. And part of that is communication and the importance of listening more and understanding more. And once you know that, you are better equipped to actually then collaborate and provide good service. And I very much agree with you there. And in your response, you talked a bit about, a marketing piece or, in some of the creative, aspects of marketing operation. And we talk a lot on this podcast about sort of this, the left brain, right brain aspect of marketing operations, hence the art of marketing operations. And so the art side of that, creative side, talk to us a little bit about that. Like how do you ensure that, your marketing operations team is always both creating really high quality and creative content, but also sort of the volume of content that's needed? And how do you track all that?
Yeah, that's another great question, Glenn. I think that is it's a conundrum that all marketing teams find themselves in. In one sense, to meet the volume and create brand consistency, you have things like templates created. And those are very helpful in a lot of situations. But I do feel like sometimes we can fall back on them a little too much. And it sort of stunts our creative work. We get used to it being, well, we'll just make it look like this, or we'll just do this, and that's how, And I think one thing with that is, yes, we're cranking out a lot, and that's easier, but then we do have opportunities to be more creative, and we can't forget to do that, and that's really important. So a couple of ways that we like to kind of keep that fresh. Having brainstorm sessions. I know I mentioned that with cross-functional teams, but I think it's just as important with your marketing department and your marketing team, specifically, those working on creative, but also including people that you maybe wouldn't normally include in the brainstorm. I think sometimes we rely on 2 people or 3 people or however big your team is. Well, you're the creative person, right? You come up with all the ideas, and we think they're going to be the answer to it all. And a lot of times they are, and they can take our ideas to different levels that we wouldn't have been able to. But I think we miss out on different perspectives. Sometimes the best ideas come from people who aren't super close to it. And so including people that you maybe wouldn't normally in your brainstorms when you're walking through creative, you just never know what those different perspectives might bring to the conversation. And I think also asking your team to push the boundaries of your brand standards. It's a fine line. Nobody wants to cross too far over where people aren't going to be able to recognize it as your brand, or it doesn't support, all of your statements and the way your company is and your image. But it is important to not just stay stuck in the same thing. Consistency is important, but so is doing something new. And I think especially today, with as many ways as people consume information, it is really appreciated. And you almost have to just stay relevant.
So in a sense, what I hear in your response is that not only maintaining the level of creativity within the boundary of your existing brand standards, but by maintaining flexibility in not only your deployment of the actual tactics that you're doing from a marketing perspective, but maintaining flexibility even in your creative approach might take you in a specific direction that might refresh the brand, provide something, attract a new audience, expand an audience, and then maybe feeds back to then updating your creative standards that adds that new element that was just recently created. Is that sort of how you view that? So in other words, you've almost added a feedback loop in a workflow process to go back and even take the creative ideas and come back and modify, the structure of a brand standard. Yeah?
Yes, definitely. I think it's important to I don't know, maybe not every year, but it's different for different industries. But for at least on a somewhat regular basis, to really review that brand standard, to really review the creative that's attached to it. Have things change? Should they change? How do we make ourselves stay current and be able to work with all the different technologies and make sure that what we're doing doesn't look extremely dated, but yet looks like us. I think keeping it fresh is important. And then I know you mentioned also, like, how do you keep it to where you're not having mistakes, those types of things, even though you're doing all this new work and you're doing a lot of work. I think for me, one of the best things that we have done is really truly kind of define our review processes. And I mean, it's not super sexy, it's not super fun, but it's important, even if it's just as simple as having 2 sets of eyes look at something, that can really, really make a big difference. And I think that's the key to making sure that when you've got a large volume of stuff going on, that you are actually having people take a minute to look at it. It's great to run it through different grammar checks and spell checks, but there's also a lot of value in having a couple sets of human eyes on it as well.
Yeah, because it's just providing that extra set, sort of an extra evaluation. Yes. Of that content. That's a good way, to your point about, if you've identified gaps in the content creation process, that's one of the ways that you can sort of address that. Has there been something that you've learned along the way in terms of content creation that, you started something, you tried it, and it just did not work? Do you have some examples of that you can share?
Yes, definitely. We've tried a couple of different campaign ideas over the last couple of years. And, for one thing, COVID changed a lot of things. We weren't doing events, things like that. So we had to look at new and different ways to approach those things. And we recently wrapped up a pretty big campaign. And while we had several pros come out of it, we also had some cons. We had quite a few lessons learned. And I think just as important as the successes, we're learning from what didn't. In our case, it was trying to overcomplicate a campaign, trying to ask too much of the audience to consume and how many steps to take in order to win something or receive a prize, any of those things. To get, that call to action was a bit too complex. And we, reeled it back in. It was too complex from, say, our own level of work within our department, but it was also we were asking too much of our audience there. And it's not that they wouldn't care or they couldn't comprehend it, it's that it's competing with a lot of other things. And so going back to less is more can also be a great lesson learned. And we recently learned that, especially when planning a campaign with multiple events and there were lots of variables and it was almost like there were too many variables. And so, it was important to learn that, and we got a lot of great feedback too. We learned things we never would have thought we would have learned at what our audience was craving and who they were really wanting to talk to within our organization. So, you definitely take that as a win for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean that any feedback is good feedback, and it just makes you better. So I think that's great. And then when you think about it, you talked about some of the campaigns and so forth, and so you think of a lot of it as digital and so forth. But when you think about physical marketing impressions, things like promotional products or water bottles or kits or physical signs or graphics or point of sale or cards or whatever it is. When you think about that and how that sort of blends with digital, how do you sort of look at making sure that your physical marketing impressions blends with your digital marketing impressions to sort of create that overall integrated marketing approach?
It's interesting because when I first started marketing, that wasn't so much a thing. The online presence wasn't a huge piece. It was more just product marketing and impressions, things like that. And so today, I think the way we have chosen to do that is looking at that physical piece that we have, whether it's a water bottle or a flashlight or whatever that item may be, tying an actual experience back to that piece. And I think, that creates a little engagement and some memory there. And so perhaps you are giving away something at a trade show and you want that to really stick with someone. They're going to use the flashlight again, but how are we going to actually make them remember what this was from and what we talked about at that event? And so really kind of allowing yourself to find a way for those to correlate. One way to do that, QR codes are fabulous for that, where you've got the digital piece and then there's a with them for the customer. Okay, well, I'm going to scan this code and I'm going to get something out of it. And that's going to be memorable and I've actually engaged in something. Apps are a perfect example too, having that technology where you can apply, I have this digital piece on my phone and by using it, I can get something out of it. Something will be sent to me or, those types of things, tying them together. Having some kind of call to action with the digital part is where we are always challenging ourselves. It's great for you to see it in a banner ad or, whatever the format is, but what are you doing with that information besides just seeing it for, a few seconds? And so one of the things we're trying to do a better job of as far as stretching our ways to tie in those pieces with actual information or an actual interaction that we had with them.
It's a great idea and a great thought, and I can see how that could just obviously tie it all together, and it just reinforces the brand, reinforces your interaction in the engagement with your customers and individuals that you're supporting. So I think that's great. So before we wrap up today's episode, what is the main takeaway that you want to share regarding the challenges facing marketing operations
Yeah,
executives?
I would say everything is subject to change. That would be a challenge and a truth. And so I think that's something that can apply outside of just marketing operations. But we've all learned that more than ever in the last few years, that things can rapidly change, and things do rapidly change sometimes. And we mentioned earlier about being agile, and that kind of approach, more iterative to things. And I think honestly, the challenge is having that approach, being agile and being able to do things while also having some stability as well, and having some type of quality assurance and routine and workflow and all of those things. They don't always seem like they go together. Well, if you're agile, then how do you can't have a workflow. Well, no, you can have both. You can absolutely have both. But also remembering that even though we all do our very best to plan, we do our best, that, a lot of the time it doesn't work out. Or maybe we get something added to it. And that's okay. That's okay. And, we learn from each step of that, and just remembering to try and find that harmony and balance between consistency and then being able to be super flexible when you need to. I think probably any marketing operations leader would tell you that is a challenge, and sometimes on a daily basis, which is what makes the job interesting. It's not the same every day. We don't just do the same 5 things every day. We're always doing new things, so it keeps it very fresh.
Well, that's an excellent summary and a powerful wrap up. I appreciate that. Well, this wraps up this episode of The Art of Marketing Operations. And thank you so much for joining us today, Heather.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. I really do appreciate it, and look forward to talking with you again.
Sounds great. Well, until next time, stay safe and take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Marketing Operations, brought to you by Taylor. Don't forget to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and share. Until next time.